The wind howled, a predator circling the skeletal frame of the isolated ranch house. Snow whipped horizontally, stinging skin and obscuring the world beyond a few feet. Inside, huddled near the meager fire, Eleanor shivered, though not entirely from the cold. The pain in her ankle was a dull, insistent throb, a constant reminder of the desperate flight that had led her here. She had stumbled, fallen, and somehow, miraculously, found this solitary dwelling on the edge of nowhere, a beacon in the blizzard's white fury. Her breath plumed in the frigid air. Every muscle ached, every nerve felt frayed. But it was the fear, cold and sharp, that truly pierced her bones. Fear of who might be following, fear of what finding her would mean, and a new, burgeoning fear of the man who had opened his door to her. He was a man of few words, a man carved from the harsh landscape itself. Silas. He had simply looked at her, standing there broken on his porch, snow plastered to her threadbare cloak, and without a sound, gestured her inside. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked where she came from, hadn't asked why a woman alone was out in such a storm, injured and clearly running. His silence was unnerving, yet it was also a fragile shield. Questions were what she dreaded most. They unearthed truths she had buried deep, truths that could shatter the precarious safety of this moment. He moved with quiet efficiency, mending the fire, heating water, roughly but carefully binding her ankle. His hands were calloused, strong, capable. She watched him through slitted eyes, curled on the floor near the hearth, a bundle of misery and apprehension. He was tall, lean, his face weathered and lined, eyes the color of a stormy sky, perpetually assessing. He seemed wary of her presence, his hospitality born perhaps of necessity or a harsh code of the frontier, rather than genuine warmth. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of her secrets pressing down like the snow on the roof. She was a trespasser, a burden, a mystery he had unwillingly accepted. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, sounded like an approaching threat. Sleep was impossible. She listened to the storm rage, to Silas's quiet movements as he banked the fire, to the frantic pounding of her own heart. Survival had brought her here, to this man, this remote place. But survival required trust, and trust required revealing parts of herself she couldn't bear to expose. Not yet, maybe not ever. The silence in the cabin was vast, broken only by the storm, yet it felt charged with potential danger. She was a trapped animal, watching her captor, uncertain if his cage offered protection or merely held her for a different fate. The ranch was his domain, austere and unforgiving, a reflection of the man himself. And she was utterly at his mercy. The days that followed blurred into a quiet, tense rhythm dictated by the storm and the simple demands of survival. Eleanor remained near the fire, her ankle slowly healing under Silas's indifferent care. He didn't fuss, didn't inquire. He simply brought her food plain, hearty fare of stew and bread, and kept the fire going. His silence was a heavy cloak, but beneath its weight, Eleanor began to find a strange sort of comfort. His lack of questions meant she didn't have to lie, didn't have to perform, didn't have to risk revealing the edges of the darkness that pursued her. She watched him move through his small, Spartan home. He repaired a saddle by the light of a lantern, sharpened knives with slow, deliberate strokes, checked on the few horses huddled in a drafty barn. His movements were economical, precise, the movements of a man used to solitude and self-reliance. There was a quiet strength about him, an unyielding presence that the storm outside seemed to respect. Her initial fear of him softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. What kind of man lived like this, alone in the vast, empty stretches of land, with nothing but the wind and the mountains for company? He was an enigma, as closed off as the storm-bound world outside. Yet, small things chipped away at the facade of his reserve. Once, catching her eye, he simply nodded towards her empty bowl. Another time, he left a clean, worn blanket near the fire without a word. These were not gestures of kindness, not exactly, but practical considerations, small acknowledgments of her presence that asked for nothing in return. They were islands of neutrality in a sea of her own fear and uncertainty. She began to rise, tentatively at first, testing her ankle. She helped with small tasks, sweeping the floor, washing dishes in cold water. Work was a distraction, a way to feel less like a burden, a way to ground herself in the stark reality of the present rather than the terrifying specters of the past. He didn't thank her or acknowledge her efforts. He simply let her. This quiet acceptance was more profound than any spoken gratitude. It was permission to exist in his space, to be present without explanation. As the storm began to abate, the world outside slowly revealing itself in shades of white and gray, her apprehension returned. The longer she stayed, the more likely it was that the trail she had left would be found. Her secrets were not just her own. They involved others, powerful others, who would not stop looking. Silas, in his unwitting hospitality, had become entangled in her danger. The thought gnawed at her, a cold counterpoint to the tentative warmth of the fire. She owed him her life, but staying might cost him his own quiet existence. The silence between them, once a refuge, now felt like a ticking clock. Every day that passed brought the outside world closer, bringing with it the potential for discovery and the inevitable confrontation with the past she had tried so desperately to outrun. The stark beauty of the thawing landscape outside was a cruel mirror to the growing tension within the cabin walls. As the snow melted and the trails became passable, the outside world began to press in. It started subtly, a rider seen in the distance, too far to identify, but enough to set Eleanor's heart hammering against her ribs. Then, a lone visitor, a grizzled man from a distant settlement, stopping by Silas's ranch, ostensibly for supplies or news. Eleanor, hidden in the small back room, listened, every nerve taut. The conversation was innocuous. Weather, livestock, the hard winter. But then, a seemingly casual question. Seen any strangers pass through, Silas? Anyone matching the description? Woman. Alone. Silas's response was low, non-committal. Nobody but the wind. The lie hung in the air, heavy and palpable. A shared secret now binding them in a way their shared silence never had. After the man left, the silence in the cabin was different. It was charged with a new understanding. Silas knew now. Not the specifics, perhaps, but enough to know she was running, and from something serious. He didn't look at her, didn't comment on her pale face or trembling hands. He simply went back to his work, but his movements were sharper, his gaze more distant. Eleanor felt a surge of guilt. She had brought this danger to his door. He had given her refuge, and in return, she had painted a target on his solitary life. She approached him later, the words catching in her throat. "You shouldn't have lied," she whispered, her voice raw. "You should have told him." Silas finally looked at her, his eyes steady, unreadable. "Wasn't your story to tell?" he said, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't an offer of protection, not explicitly, but an acknowledgement of her right to her own secrets, and perhaps a quiet acceptance of the consequences. The tentative trust that had been building in the shared quiet moments solidified into something more resilient. Necessity had brought them together, but his unspoken support, his willingness to shield her with a simple lie, forged a bond stronger than words. She started helping more actively around the ranch, her injured ankle now allowing her to move freely. She learned to mend fences, haul water, feed the horses. The physical work was a relief, a way to channel her fear into something productive. Silas taught her, patiently, silently, showing her how to hold a hammer, how to saddle a horse. In these shared tasks, a quiet partnership emerged. They were two solitary people, finding a fragile strength in shared purpose against the vast indifference of the world. But the threat was still out there. The rider in the distance reappeared, closer this time. Boot prints were found near the property line, too deliberate to be random. The hunters were closing in. The peace they had found in their shared solitude was about to be shattered. The day the riders came was bright and clear, a cruel contrast to the darkness they brought with them. 3 men, hard-faced and purposeful, rode right up to the porch. Eleanor stood behind Silas, her heart hammering against her ribs, a cold dread seizing her. This was it. The end of the running, the moment of reckoning. Silas stood tall, blocking the doorway, his face unreadable, his hand resting casually, almost imperceptibly, near the rifle leaning against the frame. "Silas," the leader said, his voice flat and menacing. "We know you got a woman here, it wasn't a question." Eleanor's breath hitched. The lies hadn't held forever. "Nobody here but me," Silas replied, his voice steady, unwavering, a rock against the tide of their intent. The leader's eyes narrowed, scanning Silas, then the cabin. "The information says different. A woman fitting her description was seen heading this way. Injured, they say. We've followed the trail," he gestured vaguely towards the thawing ground, implying competence, inevitability. Eleanor felt exposed, vulnerable, her past catching up in the form of these cold, determined men. Silas didn't move. "My place, my business," the words were quiet, but carried the weight of unyielding resolve. The tension stretched, taut and brittle. Eleanor, watching from behind him, saw the subtle shifts in their stance, the way their hands hovered near their weapons. They were gauging Silas, assessing the risk. He wasn't backing down. He was protecting her, a stranger, with the quiet, formidable strength she had only glimpsed before. Then, against the rush of her fear, a different feeling surged, a fierce, protective instinct not just for herself, but for Silas. He was putting himself in danger for her. She wouldn't let him face it alone. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, appearing beside Silas, meeting the leader's gaze head-on. She was no longer the broken, terrified woman who had arrived in the storm. Hardship had forged something new within her. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered with a defiant courage. "I am here," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "But you have no claim on me." The leader looked surprised, then smirked. "That's for us to decide, little bird." He began to dismount. But Silas's voice cut through the air, sharp and final. "This is my land. You turn around." Now there was no negotiation in his tone, only absolute certainty. For a moment, the men hesitated, caught off guard by their united front and Silas's quiet authority. They exchanged glances. The risk wasn't just Eleanor. It was Silas, this solitary, unmoving force on his own territory. The cost might be higher than they were willing to pay, not for a woman, but for challenging a man rooted so deeply in his own ground. With a final, lingering look of frustration and menace, the leader remounted. "This isn't over," he spat, more a promise than a threat, but he turned his horse, and the other two followed. Eleanor watched them ride away, the tension slowly draining from her body, leaving her weak but strangely exhilarated. They were gone for now. She looked at Silas, standing beside her, his gaze still fixed on the retreating figures. There was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition of the shared line they had just held. He had seen her fear and her defiance. She had seen his unwavering protection. The secrets were still there, but facing the threat together had changed their weight. She was no longer defined solely by what she was running from, but by the strength she had found and the unexpected alliance she had formed. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in hues of orange and purple, they sat by the fire. The silence was back, but it was different now, not heavy with unspoken fear, but comfortable, companionable. Eleanor knew the danger might return, that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wouldn't face it alone. Silas had given her shelter, protection, and in his quiet way, a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she craved. She had come seeking refuge from the past, and in doing so had stumbled into the possibility of a future. Not the one she had planned, but one built on resilience, shared hardship, and the quiet, unbreakable bond between two solitary souls who had found strength together on the edge of the world. The ranch, once a symbol of isolation, now felt like a home, fragile but fiercely defended, a testament to the quiet power of human connection forged in the face of adversity. Her journey wasn't over, but she was no longer just running. She was standing, strong and ready, side by side with the man who had saved her.